SAIS Asia Conference. Our theme this year is on U.S.-Asia relations, past and future, where we seek to examine the Obama administration's Asia rebalance policy and explore how that policy might continue in the new administration. On behalf of the SAIS Asia Conference Organizing Committee and the wider SAIS community, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Antony Blinken as our keynote speaker for this year's Asia Conference to discuss the challenges and opportunities of Washington's Asia rebalance. Mr. Blinken is the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies Herder-Nietze Distinguished Scholar at the Foreign Policy Institute.
With over 3 decades of experience in government service, Mr. Blinken has made invaluable contributions to U.S. foreign policy, having most recently served as the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State from 2015 to 2017, the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor to former President Obama from 2013 to 2015, and the National Security Advisor to former Vice President Joe Biden from 2009 to 2012.
Prior to his work with the Obama administration, Mr. Blinken served as Democratic Staff Director for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Blinken was also a member of former President Clinton's National Security Council staff at the White House from 1994 to 2001, where he served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European Affairs, and advised the President Clinton on U.S. relations with the countries of Europe, the European Union, and NATO. Mr. Blinken additionally served as the Senior Director for Speechwriting and then Strategic Planning, overseeing foreign policy planning and serving as former President Clinton's foreign policy speechwriter. Mr. Blinken began his career in government service in 1993 at the State Department as Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Canadian Affairs.
Prior to his career in government service, Mr. Blinken practiced law in New York and Paris. Mr. Blinken has written extensively on foreign policy matters in numerous publications, including the New York Times Magazine, and Foreign Affairs, and is the author of Ally versus Ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis.
Mr. Blinken obtained his undergraduate degree from Harvard College, magna cum laude, and his Juris Doctorate from Columbia Law School. Please join us in welcoming Mr. Blinken as our keynote speaker.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so very much. Kai Ashwani, thank you for the overly generous introduction. I have to say I'm very, very pleased that you mentioned my book, Ally versus Ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis, still available on Amazon. But I should warn you that one reviewer said that it's the kind of book that once put down is very hard to pick up again. I also do want to thank both of you, though, in all seriousness, for the superb stewardship of this conference. And I understand it's basically been a year in the making, and that's extraordinary, but even more extraordinary is the work that it's produced, some of which I've had a chance to see. Particularly in a world and at a time that is so fraught with complexity and uncertainty, there are few more important tasks right now than giving a platform to the next generation of scholars and policymakers. After all, who else is going to help us figure out how to get this right? We're looking to all of you, and the work that you're doing could not be more valuable, could not be more timely. So I want to say a special welcome and a special thanks to all the conference presenters and participants. Some of you I know have braved a pretty long trip to get here. All of you stand at the pinnacle of scholarship on Asia. It may be a little bit hard to imagine right now, but there's going to be a time in maybe your distant future when all you'll want to do is go back to school. After 23 years, almost 24 years in public service, I'm very fortunate to be back in school, in particular here at Johns Hopkins at SAIS. Very fortunate to be part of a remarkable community that offers extraordinary insights and analysis every single day. As you heard, and again in that overly generous introduction, I spent the better part of the Obama-Biden years at the White House, where I chaired, among other things, the Deputies Committee on the National Security Council. As many of you know, this committee convenes pretty much on a daily basis in the White House Situation Room. Representatives from across the government consider the latest intelligence reports, debate our options, formulate policy recommendations for the President and the Cabinet. It was an intensely robust and rich process that ensured as best it could that we tried to navigate a wide range of risks, everything from terrorism to Ebola, and seized strategic opportunities to reassert American leadership on the global stage. Now, about 2.5 years ago, I was leaving the White House to move over to the State Department. And just before I left, I was sitting with then-President Obama, and I asked him, what did he want me to focus on in this new assignment as Deputy Secretary of State? And we didn't lack for priorities or opportunities. Leading a coalition of 66 countries to defeat ISIL, resisting Russian aggression in Ukraine, the list goes on and on. But given everything that we had on our plates, I wanted to get guidance from the President. Is there one thing that you'd particularly like me to focus on? And his answer was immediate: Asia. Then, when I got to the department, I asked the same question of Secretary of State Kerry. And happily, I got exactly the same answer, which was a very good sign. I think it was a clear evidence, clear sign of the importance that both the President and Secretary Kerry attached to the region, and again, with very, very good reason. Nowhere in the world are the economic and strategic interests and opportunities of the United States clearer or more compelling than in the Asia-Pacific. It's home to 4 of our top 10 trading partners, 5 of our 7 treaty allies, and the world's largest and fastest growing economies, including 40% of overall global growth and soon two-thirds of the world's middle class. And of course, some of the most wired and innovative people on earth. I think what the President understood was that the rise of Asia, which had already done so much to lift millions of people out of poverty, would help define the next century. But by what rules? By which means? To what ends? Those were the vital questions to answer. And he understood that it was profoundly in the interest of the United States to play a leading role in answering those questions. And that had to start by making sure that the energy, the resources, the focus we devoted to the region were commensurate with its importance. And that's what the rebalance was all about. Over the course of 9 trips to the Asia-Pacific region in 2 years that I was Deputy Secretary of State, dozens of strategic dialogues, hundreds of meetings, I saw firsthand the growing dividends of President Obama's rebalance to the region and our common efforts with Asian partners and Pacific partners to strengthen a rules-based, institutions-based order. First, we invested in our core alliances with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia. We updated our guidelines for defense cooperation with Japan. We concluded new host nation support agreements with both Japan and the Republic of Korea. We signed a force posture agreement with Australia in 2014, and of course, the landmark Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the Philippines. Second, we deepened our engagement with emerging powers. Now, of course, that starts with China. And it's very important to note, the rebalance was not directed at China, it included China. And so we worked to build a relationship with China that was defined by broader and deeper practical engagement on issues that mattered to both of us. And if you look at what we were able to work on and even accomplish together, we really did manage to deepen and broaden the relationship. Whether it was the Iran nuclear agreement, where China played a critical role, to, of course, climate change, leading to the Paris Agreement, dealing together with Ebola, working even together to train diplomats from Afghanistan. The range became quite remarkable. And one of the things, by the way, that was really a hallmark, especially the last couple of years, is the increasing amount of work we were able to do with China in third countries in the development area. And I think that's incredibly promising for the future. At the same time, it was very important that we confront very directly, clearly, openly, our differences, which are real, and try, if not to resolve them, at least to manage them, again, through very clear, open dialogue, especially when it comes to the South China Sea, where China's conduct risks undermining the freedom of navigation and free flow of commerce that we depend upon. And there, too, I would have to say that the quality of the dialogue, the quality of the work that we did together, even where we disagreed, got to a new level. Even as we were working to build this stronger and deeper relationship with China while dealing directly with our differences, we were also engaging other emerging powers of a different kind, countries like Vietnam and Burma that were starting to turn the page on the past. Today, the U.S. and Vietnam, for example, are deepening and broadening our own ties in areas that we couldn't even imagine just 5 or 10 years ago, from military cooperation to human rights to peacekeeping. Third, we sustained and increased engagement with the institutions of the region, the East Asia Summit, ASEAN, APEC. These organizations, in our judgment, were important fora for promoting collective action, facilitating cooperation, and the peaceful resolution of differences. And they advance a regional economic, political, and security architecture in which the United States is a vital and permanent player. Fourth, we vigorously promoted trade and investment opportunities designed to unlock shared prosperity. And of course, the heart of that strategy was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which would have brought 12 APEC countries and 40% of the world's GDP together with high labor, environment, and intellectual property standards. I have to say that perhaps the biggest disappointment that I've had on substantive policy issues over the last months was the decision of the new administration to withdraw from TPP. It's not only an economic mistake, it's a strategic one. It weakens, not strengthens, the United States, and it strengthens, not weakens, our competitors. Without U.S. leadership in trade and investment, others will fill the gap and write the rules, rules that will be far less effective in leveling the playing field for our businesses, protecting workers, sustaining the environment, safeguarding intellectual property, and transparency. And when you really think about it and step back, these kinds of agreements, especially agreements negotiated to the highest standards, which is exactly what TPP was, they have to be a part of our future. 95% of the world's consumers, the world market, is beyond our borders. We would be tying our hands and shortchanging our future if we can't find ways to engage through trade and investment. Fifth, we enhanced our military posture in the region, increasing the maritime security capacity of allies and partners, rotating American personnel into new and more places, like Northern Australia, and new sites in the Philippines. By 2020, 60% of our Navy will be in the Asia-Pacific, along with many of our most cutting-edge assets. Finally, we stood up for our values, for the basic rights and freedoms of individuals throughout the region. In support of Burma's historic elections and peaceful transition of power, we helped establish the nation's first nonpartisan, independent organization for electoral observation. We trained over 11,000 political party members. We also expressed our strong concern about discrimination and violence experienced by ethnic and religious minorities, including the Rohingya population in Rakhine State, and stressed that the rule of law must be equally applied to all. I had the opportunity to go to Burma on a couple of occasions during this period, and it is one of the most remarkable, challenging transformations anywhere on earth. It's incredibly uplifting on one level, but we can't lose sight of how challenging and difficult it is at the same time. Let me finally pause on one aspect of the rebalance that I think merits a brief consideration, and that was the effort to also create within all of this new geometries of trilateral and a multilateral kind, new networks to encourage cooperation between and among our closest partners and allies. And probably at the heart of this was a very robust trilateral partnership that we worked to forge among the United States, South Korea, and Japan, under which, among other things, we convened the first ever trilateral forum at the Vice Minister or Deputy Secretary level. I had the privilege and responsibility of doing this 6 times in the 2 years that I was Deputy Secretary. And through it, I think we helped to cultivate a partnership global in scope, but also local in impact, engaging civil society, communities, business, science, health, academia, as well as government. Our cybersecurity experts worked together to protect critical infrastructure. Our space security officials discussed the norms of responsible behavior in uncharted frontiers. Our energy experts collaborated on accelerating the development of clean energy technology. Health experts worked together to look at new ways to combat cancer. The list goes on and on. And it was one of the things that really gave me tremendous satisfaction because working together in common cause really multiplied the effectiveness that the United States could even bring to the table. And it also had the beneficial impact, I think, of bringing South Korea and Japan, our 2 closest partners in the region, closer together. Above all, and I'll conclude with this, we shared a common purpose in addressing the region's most acute threat, the threat posed by North Korea. So let me conclude with a few thoughts on that subject, because it is, in many ways, the most urgent, certainly the gravest challenge that we face. In some ways, it's a relic from the past, from the social repression, command economy, and international isolation that once shrouded so many countries during the Cold War. Much of the rest of the world has moved forward toward peace, reason, prosperity, and dignity. North Korea and the regime there have categorically refused to step out of the shadows of humankind's past. And you all know, this is a regime that operates enormous prison camps at home, denies its citizens nearly all basic rights, imposes a system of surveillance and censorship so repressive, it really has no comparison in the modern age. And even people who think they may be safe in this regime, at the pinnacle, of the elite, are not, as it turns out, as we've seen from the reign of internal terror that Kim Jong-un has conducted over the last couple of years. And of course, this is the only regime to test a nuclear device in the 21st century. Over the past year, in particular, Kim Jong-un has relentlessly accelerated the effort to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile that, married with a nuclear warhead, could actually reach the United States. 2 nuclear tests and 30 missile tests later over this past year, North Korea is closer than ever before to putting that capability in the hands of a leader who acts, to put it charitably, impulsively, maybe even irrationally, and may not be bound by the rules of deterrence. As we looked at this, we did not find a quick military fix to the challenge posed by North Korea. As many of you know, North Korea's nuclear missile complex is concealed underground, inside mountains, sometimes in places unknown to our intelligence. Meanwhile, one area where the country is making rapid progress is with mobile missiles powered by solid fuel that can be hidden, rolled out, and prepared for launch within a matter of minutes. Even if we had an effective preemptive strike capacity, the consequences of using it could be prohibitive. Pyongyang possesses thousands of artillery pieces, rockets, just 30 miles from Seoul. One retaliatory salvo could decimate South Korea's capital. So, where does that leave us? Ultimately, it leaves us with some kind of negotiated settlement that, at least in my judgment, first freezes and then rolls back North Korea's nuclear program with inspectors to carefully scrutinize compliance, much as we did with Iran. Now, the big downside, of course, of a monitored freeze as a first step is that it leaves in place North Korea's very dangerous existing capacity. But it would prevent North Korea from testing its missiles and nuclear devices. That's critical to further progress for its capacity. It would enhance our knowledge of the program through inspectors. and it would create some time and space to see if we could negotiate a comprehensive rollback of the nuclear and missile program. Such an agreement could, at the end of the day, include the peace treaty that Pyongyang says it wants, provided it effectively denuclearizes. Now, until now, Kim Jong-un has refused to take this path, whereas arguably his father and grandfather saw North Korea's nuclear assets as a bargaining chip. Kim Jong-un seems to see them as his only insurance policy against regime change. So the question for policymakers in our administration and now in President Trump's administration is, what, if anything, can change that calculus and convince him to come to the negotiating table in good faith? I think the best answer we can give is that it's possible, far from certain, maybe not even probable, but possible, that a truly comprehensive, truly sustained, and relentless international pressure campaign led by the United States, South Korea, Japan, and ideally China, that raises the price on Mr. Kim's obstinacy to the point where he believes his survival is in jeopardy because he can no longer pay for his weapons or pay off elites, that could have the effect of convincing him to change his strategic calculus. That pressure campaign, of course, has to start with China, with which North Korea has the closest of economic relationships, a unique relationship. Virtually all of North Korea's trade, investment, goes to, through, from China. Now, when you talk to our Chinese partners, they say, our influence has declined dramatically with North Korea. They just don't listen to us. And there may be some truth to that their influence has diminished. But if their influence has diminished, their actual leverage has not, if they choose to exercise it. By curbing imports from North Korea, as China recently did with coal, which generates about 1/3 of North Korea's export revenues, Beijing can exert unique pressure. So it made a good start, but it has to do more. Under the Obama administration, we closely engaged with Beijing at the highest levels, starting, of course, with the president, to seek greater Chinese cooperation in denying Mr. Kim the resources to fund his nuclear pursuits and to buy off his elites. In fact, the last trip that I took in my old job as Deputy Secretary of State was to Beijing to work on exactly that issue. We made it clear that something had fundamentally changed from our perspective in the threat posed by North Korea, that the qualitative improvements of the program had taken it to a new level, and that just as Taiwan is, in China's words, a core interest for Beijing, now North Korea and the threat that it poses is a core interest of the United States. As a result, we told our Chinese friends, we will take every step necessary to defend ourselves and the treaty partners that we are sworn to protect, including through the deployment of missile defenses like the infamous THAAD system, enhanced maritime presence, and additional sanctions against any entity or individual, including from China, whose economic engagement supports the regime and its military and nuclear ambitions. We've made it clear that none of these steps were or would be aimed at China, but at the end of the day, we had to do what was necessary to protect ourselves and our partners from a growing threat. That, in a way, was the most visible part of the pressure campaign, and it was undergirded by the two strongest UN Security Council resolutions we were able to achieve. But as important, in my judgment, in possibly getting us to where we want to go, is what we were doing around the world with the rest of the world. It got a lot less attention, less visibility, but working in weekly, and I mean this, weekly coordination with South Korea and Japan, we identified and then sought to sever the political, economic, and diplomatic ties that North Korea enjoys around the world. Quietly, but systematically, we went from country to country in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, asking them, pressing them, urging them to sever these ties. And we got real results. Gone are the days when DPRK flag vessels can simply sail freely from port to port, moving illicit cargoes. Gone are the days when North Korea's national airline, Air Koryo, has similar unfettered access to international airports. Gone are the days when North Korea can move the proceeds from prohibited activities through the international financial system. Gone are the days when its diplomats can function, in effect, as money launderers and bagmen for the regime's illicit revenue streams. Gone are the days when North Korean guest workers can send remittances back home with impunity, not to feed their families, but to feed the regime's military and nuclear programs. To date, by our best estimate, these efforts, again, in very close coordination with South Korea and Japan, cut in half high-level North Korean exchanges with other countries and possibly deprive the regime of as much as several $100 million in revenues. Pursuing this effort should be, in my judgment, one of the Trump administration's most urgent missions. And again, at the end of the day, whether it actually succeeds in changing the calculus, I can't say with any certainty. We just don't know. We do know that of all of the options before us, it probably offers the best path forward. And while North Korea and Iran are obviously very, very different, this basic approach, pursued systematically, comprehensively, in a sustained way, can get results. It is a little bit remarkable that this needs to be said in 2017, but closely coordinated campaigns to preserve the national security of the United States and that of our allies are not possible without dogged, daily diplomacy, a word that sometimes falls into disfavor, but is one of our greatest sources of strength. We need that dogged daily diplomacy. We need sustained, skilled global engagement. We need robust, confident, well-funded diplomacy, starting with the State Department and an empowered group of Foreign Service officers. In my experience, diplomacy is not incidental to our country's strength, prosperity, and security. It's intrinsic to it. Indeed, diplomacy and development on the one hand and defense on the other are flip sides of the same national security coin. You really can't have one without the other to be effective. Entering the Oval Office at a time when the United States was a bit isolated on the world stage, President Obama knew the risks of ignoring our allies and stiff-arming potential partners. As he demonstrated through the rebalance with Asia, President Obama recognized that the international system, however imperfect, however frustrating, is not a threat to our interests, but rather a logical, indispensable extension of those interests. On one of my final trips to the region, I touched down in Hanoi. Now, as Deputy Secretary, you're not really supposed to have favorites, but I have to admit that Vietnam was one of the places I most liked to travel to. And in many ways, the young people there sound just like their brothers and sisters right here at SAIS or in Silicon Valley. The exact same energy, the same passion, the same talent, the same curiosity, the same occasional frustrations with government for moving so slowly. On that trip, I had the privilege of speaking to several hundred students at Vietnam National University, a talk that I was told at the time was the first by a visiting U.S. official that was live-streamed, uninterrupted, and unedited online. At the end of the speech, I spent some time taking questions, and I have to tell you, they were smart, they were tough, they were probing. One student asked me whether we would maintain our engagement with Asia in the next administration. Another asked about the future of the Waisili program that some of you may know about, a network that is now 67,000 strong, that connects dynamic young people throughout ASEAN to the United States and, as important, to each other. Another question was about how the U.S. and Vietnam could build an even stronger friendship and partnership going forward. But what I picked up was that there was a subtext to each of these questions, and it was pretty much the same. Please, please, do not let the United States retreat. We need you. We want you. And I have to tell you, it's a refrain that I've heard all over the world. Regardless of where I travel or with whom I've spoken, I found that there's one thing that consistently attracts other people and other countries to our own. It's not always about our policies. And it isn't even about our politics, hard as that is to imagine. It's about something more profound. It's about a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. It's about an unwavering belief in freedom, in rights, in the dignity of every single human being. A truth as inalienable as it will prove indestructible. It's about a rich tradition of scholarship and research that each of you embody so powerfully today. It's about understanding and acknowledging that we have these ideals and sometimes, maybe even often, fall short of them. But we recognize that, we work on that, and we try constantly to make a more perfect union. That's what attracts people to our country, at least in my experience. That's something that we cannot afford to lose going forward. And thankfully, the work that all of you are doing, whether you're American or not, actually advances that common set of values that has so much resonance around the world. So, thank you so much for letting me join you today. I look forward to becoming a student of your work as you write the next chapter in the relationship between the United States and the Asia Pacific. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, can you hear me? Yeah, we'll move on to audience Q&A now, if that's okay. And please, we'd encourage students to ask questions first, and then move on to our other guests.
And please tell me who you are and what you've been working on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blinken, for your very insightful keynote address. My name is Sundar. I'm a second-year graduate student with Georgetown's Democracy and Governance program. Much of what you said resonates with what I study and work on. My presentation was on the U.S.-India bilateral relationship, assessing the potential, the progress and the potential. But my question, I wanted to go off what you said about TPP and the incomplete, well, aspects of it. And I was wondering, and this is a big what-if question I'm asking, if you had a second chance, and if the administration had a second chance, would you have done it any differently to make sure that it wasn't contingent upon the politics and rhetoric of subsequent administration?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a great question, one I suspect a number of us will be asking ourselves for a long time. I'm not sure that we could have. I think we were, in part, just a victim of timing. Timing is often a lot in life, and unfortunately, it came together just in advance of an election period. And look, let's be totally honest. It's not just the Trump administration that turned its back on TPP. So did the Democratic candidate for president. And despite the fact that if you asked people in the quiet of night in Congress if they were for it, most actually were, in advance of an election, a lot of people got cold feet. I have to say, our hope was that if Secretary Clinton had won the election, even having been against TPP, there would be a period between the election and the inauguration of the new president in which we would be able to move forward with it and try and get it through Congress. But of course, didn't happen. You know, there is a tradition in this country of doing the wrong thing before doing the right thing. And my hope is that in some fashion, we'll come back to it. And again, as we were discussing earlier, it's just so profoundly in our self-interest. That's what's frustrating about it. And my trade and economist friends can go into detail about the economic benefits, including the 18,000 taxes or tariffs that would have been eliminated on U.S. products. But for me, it was really as much about the strategic proposition of TPP as it was about its economic benefits. And at the end of the day, the world is not self-organizing. Some ones have to do it. We've played a lead role in doing just that for over 70 years. If we get out of that business, whether it's writing a trade agreement, whether it's organizing an alliance, whether it's supporting peacekeeping, you name it, either it's not going to happen, or it's going to happen in a way that, frankly, is less advantageous to our interests and our values. And so when it comes to a trade agreement, if we're not the one playing a lead role in writing it, chances are the benefits for our own businesses will be less, the protections for workers, the environment, intellectual property, transparency will be fewer. It will be to a lower standard, not a higher standard, a race to the bottom, not to the top. That's just not in our interest. And finally, I would say that, look, every administration takes whatever its approaches are to a particular issue. Maybe it comes in with a certain ideology. Usually, ideology has a way of running into something called reality, and then things move in a different direction.
Hello, my name is Chao, and I study Chinese history at GW. And so I have two questions. The first one is regarding the Korean Peninsula. Recently, the South Korean president has been arrested, and this is a huge setback to the Conservative Party in South Korea. And the upcoming new president will likely be a liberal president who has a very soft stance on North Korea issues. And you just said that we need to bring North Korea go back to the negotiation table. So would you say that having a softer stance towards North Korea would make them go back to the negotiation table, or we're being tough on North Korea? Would you say the arrest of the former South Korean president a setback of future American policy toward North Korea? And the second one is that President Xi Jinping of China is going to visit Florida next week. And I recently read a comment that the inability of President Donald Trump's dealing with his domestic foe, says that he cannot even pass in the Congress to deal with the Obamacare. And the comment says that people say President Trump is an orange guy. And in China, we always criticize America being a paper tiger. And Donald Trump is already orange, and the only thing he lacks is a white strip. And would you say that's the Chinese people will view Donald Trump as a president of a lame duck, like he doesn't have any ability to control the domestic issue, and toward foreign policies or toward China, he will become more softer than he originally said during the campaign? Thank you.
Good. Both very good questions. Let me try to briefly address them. And again, I want to start from one premise before answering directly. And that premise is that it is profoundly in the interests of the United States and China to continue to find ways to deepen and broaden our cooperation and relationship, even as we compete in different areas and even as we have real differences on certain issues. So that's the underlying premise of everything I would say. In fact, nothing could be more important in my judgment for the peace, prosperity, and progress of the next decades than getting that relationship right. Having said that, look, on North Korea, I wish that a softer approach, what the South Koreans pursued in the past, the Sunshine Policy, could produce results. And if we thought that it could, then we would advocate pursuing it. But we've seen no evidence, unfortunately, to the contrary, with Kim Jong-un about an interest on the part of North Korea in truly engaging in a meaningful way on denuclearization. As you know, probably, in 2005, all of the parties concerned, including North Korea, signed an agreement that bound North Korea to engage in meaningful, authentic, credible negotiations on denuclearization, and that could have led in turn and in time to the prospect of actually looking at the armistice agreement and turning that into some kind of more enduring peace agreement. But unfortunately, ever since then, North Korea has not engaged, refused to engage, and with the rise of Kim Jong-un, we've made multiple overtures, direct overtures, from the United States to North Korea to test their willingness to engage, and the answer we got was one word, in effect, no. What Kim Jong-un is trying to do is to get the world and the United States to accept North Korea's status as a nuclear country and nuclear power, which is not acceptable to us. It's not acceptable to China. And it has shown no willingness to even engage on the question of denuclearization, much less actually do it. So unless and until that changes, we're in a very difficult place. I don't see a policy that starts with some kind of peace agreement as being the way forward, because I think it's just a means for North Korea to pocket its nuclear status, which again is unacceptable to both of us. I don't know how the future South Korean government will approach the issue. Again, I think there's a difference often between what you say and what you believe when you're out of power campaigning for office versus the realities that confront you when you're in office. So that reality may have an effect on the next South Korean administration. And at the end of the day, as I read what, for example, Mr. Moon has said, I don't think there's a big gap between what he said and what I was suggesting a little bit earlier. That is, the objective that we have is not to bring Kim Jong-un and North Korea to its knees. It's to bring them back to the table in a meaningful, credible way. And the only question before us is, how do we do that? And in our judgment, at least, unless we exert additional pressure in a sustained, comprehensive way, it probably won't work. But we will have to see. Second, I would just suggest that when it comes to the second part of your question, I found that it's always a big mistake to underestimate or count out the United States. I remember in 2009, 2010, when we were at the depths of the financial crisis here, I traveled to China with then Vice President Biden. And our friends in China were, I would have to say, feeling very good about things in China, and were having a little bit of pleasure in pointing out that things weren't going so well in the United States. And they even suggested that maybe they'd have to pull out some of their investments because, boy, really can't count on the U.S. economy. And Vice President Biden said, go ahead, that's fine. And of course they didn't. And ironically, even in the depth of our financial crisis, more and more investment was coming to the United States, which remains the surest place. And of course, China in the last few years has been pursuing a very aggressive policy of foreign direct investment, including here. And it's simply a way of saying that it's a very big mistake, even when we're going through challenges and difficulties, to count us out, or as the Vice President Biden used to say, it's never a good bet to bet against the United States. So I hope that President Xi, when he's here, will pursue the very good dialogue that he had with President Obama, that he will, and President Trump, will look for ways to deepen and broaden the areas of cooperation that we have, and that he will recognize that even when we may be going through a challenging period, don't bet against us. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for being here and for your insightful remarks. My name is Donna Artusi, and I am in the Georgetown Security Studies program in the School of Foreign Service, and I focus on international security.
By the way, detect a Georgetown mafia presence here.
There's a lot of us, I guess, around. And so I focus on technology and security, and my question is, do you perceive China's growing nuclear force modernization and growing cyber capabilities and even space capabilities as a means to potentially, I I guess, be leveraged as a way to bring North Korea to the table, as you were saying earlier, in a means that is not necessarily speaking to only diplomatic measures, but sort of going beyond that a little bit?
Well, I think there are two things. Thank you very much. I think there are two separate strands there. Look, it is very normal that as China continues to emerge as a truly great power, that its military capacity would follow in kind. And we're seeing that, and that's not unusual or unexpected. And in fact, to date, I think China has been, you could argue, relatively restrained in its nuclear program, making sure that it had an arsenal that was sufficient to provide for a strategic deterrent, but not, at least up until now, going much beyond that, which is overall, I think, a positive development. I have concerns, and I think we should all have concerns on all sides, that especially in some of the new frontiers, the new realms, whether it's cyber or whether it's space, that we work a lot harder to see if we can develop basic norms of behavior in peacetime. Because I do worry that we often attribute to each other motives and actions that may not actually be grounded in fact, but that then cause us, all of us, United States, China, Russia, you name it, to take steps that make things more dangerous, not less. So this is an area where there's a lot of work to be done, particularly, again, in the cyber area, where we've started to work more closely with China, I think, and gotten some positive results, although more needs to be done. Less so with Russia, as the Daily News suggests. When it comes to North Korea and the impact there, let me add one thing. Look, I think we all know that, and it's absolutely understandable, China's biggest concern is instability on the Korean Peninsula that leads to some kind of crisis that, among other things, potentially leads to millions of North Koreans fleeing into China, or, at the end of the day, leads to some kind of reunification that removes, the strategic buffer that China now enjoys between itself and South Korea and, in effect, the United States. That's very understandable. However, I think that increasingly, at least in my conversations with Chinese counterparts, there is a growing recognition that the greatest source of instability in the region is North Korea and the actions of its regime, and that China has a profound interest in trying to do something with us about that. Now, one of the areas I think would benefit from a deeper dialogue with China is thinking through together some of these crisis scenarios, including scenarios that lead to some kind of reunification of the peninsula. Because it would be important to demonstrate to China that its core interests, even in such scenarios, can be preserved. And if it gets that confidence, then it may be more willing to help exert meaningful pressure, knowing that if things go badly, the consequences would not be bad for China. In any event, I think we have a real imperative to do that because first, one sees reports about potential instability in the regime in North Korea. I don't want to make too much of that. We've heard that for years. On the other hand, I alluded to this earlier, Kim Jong-un has been conducting an extraordinary reign of internal terror, directed including against people who before had every reason to believe they were absolutely safe, the most senior people in the regime, several of whom have apparently been executed with artillery shells. At some point, that suggests to me that someone is going to conclude that he or she should take matters into their own hands before Kim Jong-un directs his ire against them. So that leads to concern that you could see some kind of effort to remove him internally, and that we have to be prepared for. One of the things we absolutely have to be prepared for, together with South Korea, with China, as well as with the broader international community, is what to do about the nuclear capacity the different sites in North Korea, again, in the event of some kind of regime collapse or reunification. We need a coordinated plan for how to deal with that, not a free-for-all that potentially leads to conflict. In the back?
Yes, I had a similar question. I'll just follow up. My question is, what are the trade-offs between North America and, I guess, Asian countries in terms of freedom of information shared between the two countries?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the very end of that question? I just missed it.
So what is the trade-off between North America and Asian countries in terms of freedom of information?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I understanding where you're going, I mean, there are two things there. One is, I think we all have an interest in, when it comes, for example, to cyber, space, nuclear, in having as much transparency and sharing of information as possible to take down, reduce, eliminate suspicions of each other. That is a path toward greater stability. And so, again, I would hope that we can do more of that in these different areas. Now, there's another kind of freedom of information, of course, which is simply the free flow of information of all kinds in our societies and the different ways that our countries and societies approach it. And of course, this is right now one of the biggest issues that we're facing here, regulating, thinking about how we deal with information, particularly with the advent of so-called fake news. And this is a problem that, again, would probably benefit from some thinking and working together before it gets even more out of hand than it already is. Yes, sir.
So since the judge's decision to cancel or block Trump's immigration ban, along with the failure to pass the repeal and replacement of Obamacare, a lot has been said about President Trump's. Sorry, let me introduce myself. My name is Aaron Walayat. I'm a first-year law student at Emory University. Right. So a lot has, with these stops on Trump's policies, certain individuals like the conservative commentator Charles Krauthammer has celebrated it as showing that America's checks and balances are working. And to go off of that, if there's a rising interest in maybe limiting President Trump's powers more to the constitutionally enumerated powers given in a big reversal from the deference of the Bush and Obama administrations. If this goes on to be a more permanent understanding of more limited presidential powers, will this weaken America's global role?
It's a great question, and in many ways, one that deserves a whole conversation. Look, we've seen an ebb and flow throughout our history in the relative power of the executive branch, often tied to war or conflict where, as a general rule, the power of the executive branch has increased. People feel like the most important thing is security, and they tend to look to the executive branch to provide it, whereas in times of relative peace and prosperity, sometimes the alleged excesses of the executive branch are held more in check, and other components of our system assert themselves. So I think we've seen this throughout the sweep of our history. Now, this may be a particularly unusual time. I've been gratified personally that our institutions have demonstrated their resilience. We've seen, faced with concerns that some of the decisions or efforts by the administration have raised, we've seen, as you suggested, the legislative branch play a role, particularly the judicial branch play a very, very strong role. The Ninth Circuit decision on the initial immigration order was quite extraordinary. By the way, I don't know if any of you watched it, but when the Ninth Circuit was deliberating, CNN and MSNBC and the other cable networks were showing it, but it was, as you may remember, it was being done over the telephone. They weren't filming it. The hearing was being held over the phone, and the lawyers for the administration and for the state arguing it out, and what the screens were showing on TV was just a flat picture of a still photo of the judges and of the lawyers. Not exactly compelling TV, right? The numbers, the viewership went through the roof for CNN and MSNBC. People were riveted. I thought it was a moment of profound hope because it showed the interest and passion of people for this kind of civil discourse and for the way the system's supposed to work. So, to me, and I say this as someone who's worked both in the executive branch and in the legislative branch, and of course, when you're at one side of Pennsylvania Avenue, you think all the problems reside on the other side, and vice versa. I see this more as a pendulum that sometimes goes in one extreme or another, but then usually sort of winds up back in some state of rough equilibrium. And when you're in the middle of that, those kinds of swings, it can feel very jarring and very uncertain. And it also sends messages of confusion and uncertainty sometimes to the rest of the world, which is challenging. But at the end of the day, I believe that the demonstration of checks and balances, the demonstration of the resilience of the system against any one actor pushing in what may be perceived as an extreme direction, is our greatest source of strength. And that in time, that resonates around the world as well. We've gone through, look, for me, this is a challenging period. For many of my fellow citizens, it is. But talk to people who were where you're sitting in the late 1960s. Think about it. In the space of a year, we had a President Johnson who, driven by the desire to be President of the United States, decided that he had to give up on that ambition of being elected again because of the Vietnam War and the strong opposition to that. We had the assassination of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy. We had the killing of students at Kent State University. We had a country that seemed like it was on the verge of exploding in all sorts of directions. So in many ways, far more intense than anything that we're experiencing today. And even then, it held. And we moved on, and we had, in many ways, a pretty progressive period after that. So, long way of saying, I don't know how this is going to play out, and this push and pull, but I still believe, maybe naively, that as our institutions demonstrate their resilience, that's a source of ultimately of strength for the country, including the way we project ourselves around the world. Thank you.
Again, do we have time for one more question?
One more, okay. I'll let you choose.
Thanks for the honor, Mr. Blinken. I'm a Jeevan Singh, a SAIS graduate student. I have a more Southeast Asia-centric question. So we are quite well aware that the Trump administration is not likely to pay much attention to Southeast Asia or to ASEAN. I think that's quite clear from the start. What would you, having interacted with a lot of your interlocutors from Southeast Asia, from ASEAN, what would you tell them to do to get the attention of the Trump administration? What can they do on their end to perhaps get the Trump administration to focus a bit more of their efforts back towards Southeast Asia, towards Asia, and maybe ASEAN as well?
Yeah. That's a wonderful, loaded question, because one is tempted to answer, no, I'm not going to go there, actually. I think it's probably a bad idea. Actually, it was very funny. Some of you may have seen online, I'm trying to remember who did this, if it was one of the Scandinavian countries did a fake ad for itself, trying to get the attention of the new administration. So maybe they should be inspired by that. I can't remember if it was the Dutch or the Danes or someone. Some of you probably saw it. It's very, very, very funny. So there, you might be inspired by that. Look, Partly, unfortunately, I think for all of the many incredibly positive and good things that are going on, there also are some real challenges that may come and rear their heads, including, for example, alas, the efforts of various violent extremists to extend their reach in the region that the administration will have to pay attention to and want to pay attention to. It's an unfortunate way of getting attention, but that reality may cause them to do more. Look, if they are serious about pursuing trade and investment agreements on a bilateral basis as opposed to doing it collectively, there may be opportunities that can present themselves in the region that they should look to and that they could be encouraged to look to. Again, that's not the way I would do it, but at least that suggests itself. But you know, at the end of the day, I think it falls to many of us here in the United States to continue these conversations, this dialogue, and to try to put a spotlight on not just the benefits, but the imperative of engaging with Southeast Asia. Again, looking at economies that are a tremendous source of growth and potential, looking at a young, wired, connected population in so many countries that would make wonderful partners for the United States going forward. Those of us who've had any exposure to that just have an obligation to try to keep the spotlight on it. And again, hopefully reality intrudes to the point where attention is paid. That would be my hope. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much. Wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
We'll be taking a 30-minute break, so please feel free to use the restroom and then come back for panels 3 and 4.